The distant sound of helicopters broke the silence of the rainforest like a steely wail. On the muddy ground, heavy boots sank into the earth, while the smell of gunpowder and sweat mingled in the humid Vietnamese air. It was 1968, and the world seemed to have lost any sense of compassion. But in the midst of that scenario of death and fear, there was something that still pulsed, something that could not be destroyed by gunshots or bombs. The hope written in a letter. Among the hundreds of soldiers crossing the jungle, eyes always alert for invisible ambushes, a young man with a dirty face and torn uniform held a small, crumpled envelope against his chest. His name was Michael Turner. For his companions, he was just another number, another face in the midst of the war. But to someone thousands of miles away, he was everything. And in that letter, he carried more than words. He carried a thread of life that connected him to everything he loved and everything he wanted to be again. The imaginary camera approaches, focusing on Michael's trembling hand, covered in mud, tightly gripping the faded envelope. A shot rings out in the distance, but he doesn't even move. His eyes, red from lack of sleep and repressed tears, are fixed on that little paper anchor. At that moment, the war disappears for a few seconds. There is no jungle. There are no invisible enemies. There is only the memory of home, the soft sound of her voice echoing in his mind, and the promise he had made to himself to survive. Great battles are not always won by weapons. Some are overcome by love. And what you're about to discover is the true story of how a seemingly ordinary card became an invisible shield, stronger than any armor. A letter that went through the hell of war to save not just one love, but two souls who refused to let darkness win. In Vietnam, there were no guarantees. One day you were breathing, the next it was just a name engraved on a cold plate. The letters, when they arrived, were like miracles. They were tangible proof that the world beyond the war still existed, then more importantly, that you still belonged to it. For many soldiers, receiving a letter was like receiving a life transfusion. But for Michael, there was one letter in particular, a letter that he should not open except at his worst moment, when the desire to give up was greater than the strength to fight. This letter was written by Elizabeth, his fiancée, before he embarked. She didn't know what he would face. She didn't know how many horrors he would see, how many friends he would lose. But he knew one thing, that their love needed to survive, even if they didn't. Then she put everything she felt into words. Not an ordinary miss you letter, but a rescue letter. A line thrown into the ocean of pain, ready to pull you back. As the jungle continued to echo explosions and screams, Michael felt the weight of the letter, as if it were his own heart beating outside his chest. He hadn't read it yet. He knew that that moment, that specific moment that Elizabeth had written for, was yet to come. And he prayed, silently, that it would never have to come to that. But war is a cruel machine, which does not respect prayers or amulets. Soon, Michael would face the darkest day of his life, and it would be there, on the brink of death, that that letter would reveal its true power. So, when you hear about great feats of courage during the Vietnam War, about military strategies or historic victories, remember, sometimes, the greatest act of courage happens in silence. In the moment when a young man, in the midst of chaos, decides to believe in a few handwritten words, words that went through fire and blood to ignite a spark of hope, words that would literally be the difference between life and death. This is not just the story of a letter, it's the story of a promise. It's the story of how love, even in the darkest places on earth, can find a way to survive. It's the story of Michael and Elizabeth, and it's the story you're about to live. Get ready to dive into a journey where every word written with love was more powerful than any weapon loaded with hate. Get ready to feel, to cheer, to be moved, because this is the true story of the letter that saved a love, and maybe even a life, during the Vietnam War. Michael Turner was never a hometown hero. He didn't see himself as someone special, and perhaps that was exactly what made him so remarkable. Born and raised in the small town of Brookfield, in the heart of the United States, Michael grew up amid golden fields of wheat, white clapboard churches, and lazy afternoons spent on the banks of the river. He was the middle child in a family of 3 brothers, the kind of boy who played baseball on the weekends, who worked at the local grocery store to save money for college, and who always helped his mother bring in her groceries. With his disheveled brown hair and a shy smile that seemed to light up his face, Michael was someone who won people over, not with his grandiosity, but with his kindness. He had hazel eyes that seemed to carry all the silence and sweetness of the vast plains where he grew up. He was reserved, but when he spoke, his words carried weight. He was never one to make big speeches, but the few "I love yous" he whispered were more sincere than any poem. At 22, Michael was on the threshold of his dreams. I had just been accepted to the State University to study civil engineering. He dreamed of building bridges, buildings, of leaving his mark on the world in a solid and silent way, like someone who builds something that stands the test of time without needing applause. And there was also Elizabeth, or Lizzie, as he called her, the girl with golden eyes and an easy smile, whom he had known since childhood. The wedding was already in the plans. All they had to do was save a little more money, finish their studies, and finally build the White House with a balcony that they drew so much on napkins during their meetings at the city cafe. But the world had other plans. The year was 1967, and Vietnam seemed increasingly out of the news and closer to the backyards of American families. When the summons arrived, Michael received it with a bitter mixture of fear and resignation. He was not a fanatical patriot, but he was also not someone who would run away from the call. He knew that, in his city, refusing would be seen as cowardice. And deep down there was something more, a deep sense of duty. If his friends went, he would go too. He promised Lizzie he would return. He promised his mother he would write. And he promised himself that he would keep his dream of a simple and happy life alive. On the day of departure, the whole city gathered at the small train station. It was a cool autumn morning, and the leaves were falling in golden swirls. Lizzie was there, wearing a blue dress that fluttered in the wind, her eyes filled with tears that she fought not to shed. Michael held her tightly, as if he could, in that embrace, freeze time and prevent the train from arriving. Into her shaking hands, Lizzie placed a small envelope, sealed with a red ribbon. "Only open it when you feel like you can't continue," she whispered in his ear, before walking away. He didn't have the courage to ask what was inside. He preferred to keep that little hope in his uniform pocket, close to his heart, like an invisible talisman. The trip to Vietnam was long and silent. Michael spent his days looking out the window of the military bus, watching the landscapes change, thinking about the White House, the porch, the smell of fresh coffee on Sunday mornings. But as the plane touched down in Da Nang and the humid heat of the jungle invaded his lungs, he knew that everything he knew was far, far away. Michael was not a natural soldier. He was an ordinary boy thrown into an incomprehensible hell. His first week on Vietnamese soil was a brutal shock. The constant noise of helicopters, the fear of surprise attacks, the loneliness of not knowing if he would see the next day. Friends he had met on the first night disappeared on the second day. Every letter received was a relief. Every unreceived letter was an open wound. And through it all, there was Lizzie's letter still sealed, still untouched, like a silent promise that if he could hold out, something awaited him beyond this nightmare. Michael Turner was, after all, the living portrait of so many anonymous young people of that generation, dreamers torn from the fields and small towns, sent into a war they didn't fully understand, but which they faced with silent and devastating courage. His strength did not come from military training or combat experience. His strength came from something much deeper, from the love he left behind and the promise he carried with him. He didn't know it yet, but the real battle he would have to face wouldn't just be against the invisible enemy of the Vietnamese jungle. It would be against despair, against forgetfulness, against the growing desire to give up. And when that moment arrived, when darkness threatened to erase the brightness of his dreams once and for all, it would be that letter, handwritten and soaked in love, that would show him the way back. The train roared in the distance, its sound echoing between the hills like an inevitable omen. Brookfield Station, with its old wooden structure and weathered benches, seemed too small to contain the magnitude of the grief that spread among those there. Men in uniforms, mothers with red eyes, girlfriends trying to smile through their tears, and between them, Michael and Elizabeth, clinging to each other as if they could somehow stop time from moving forward. It was a grey October morning, but the cold that Elizabeth felt did not come from the biting wind that crossed the platform. It came from within, from the hole that opened in her chest every time she looked at Michael's face and saw there not only the man she loved, but also the boy who, since he was little, dreamed of simple things, a home, a family, a future with her. They didn't need many words at that moment. They had said everything on the previous nights. on the long walks under the city's starry sky, in the notes discreetly left on the doorstep, in the promises whispered between tears. But even so, there was something Elizabeth needed to do, something that hadn't been said properly yet. As Michael adjusted his battered backpack over his shoulder, trying to hide his trembling hands, Elizabeth reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small cream envelope tied with a red ribbon. It was simple, but it carried within it the weight of everything she could never express out loud. "Promise you'll only open this peephole on your worst day," she said, her voice trembling, almost breaking mid-sentence. Michael, confused, took the envelope carefully, as if it were made of glass. His eyes met hers, and in that instant, without needing to explain, they both understood that letter would be the last resort. It would be the anchor for when all else failed. The last piece of home he would have to hold on to when the war tried to strip him of even hope. He didn't say anything. He just nodded, his throat closed with emotion, and put the envelope in the inside pocket of his jacket, where his heart was beating fast. The train whistle cut through the air, calling the soldiers like a call they couldn't refuse. The few minutes that remained seemed so fragile, so brief, that they barely knew how to spend them. Michael ran his finger across Elizabeth's face, as if trying to memorize every feature, every line, every curve of the smile he loved so much. Elizabeth, in turn, held his hand tightly, as if her touch could cross the months and oceans that would soon separate them. "Come back to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll be back, I promise," he replied, knowing deep down that promises made in the shadow of war were as fragile as glass. The moment of boarding was brutal in its simplicity. A quick, desperate kiss, like someone trying to breathe before sinking into unknown waters. One last look, a wave that seemed as definitive as an eternal farewell. And then, Michael got on the train, taking with him his heavy backpack, fear disguised as bravery, and Elizabeth's letter, folded and hidden close to his heart. Elizabeth stood there, motionless, watching the train pull away, carrying half of her with it. The tears finally broke through her barriers, and she let them fall, without shame, without containment. Every meter the train covered was as if it ripped away a part of her soul, but she forced herself to stay, watching until the last carriage disappear around the bend in the railway. Because if he had the strength to go, she needed the strength to wait. At home, the silence was even more cruel. Every corner of the small house shared memories, the forgotten book on the sofa, the favorite mug in the sink, the crumpled note in the coat pocket. Elizabeth sat on the porch, looking at the horizon that now seemed infinitely more distant, and held between her fingers the red bow of another envelope, the original, the first version of the letter, which she had written and rewrote so many times before handing the final one to Michael. She knew she couldn't protect Michael from the war. I couldn't ward off the bullets, the dangers, the loneliness, but it could give him a reason to fight, a reminder that, somewhere in the world, someone believed in him with all the strength of their being. The match had taken place. The separation was real. And now, all that was left between them were handwritten words, promises engraved deep in their chests, and a letter that, if used at the right time, might be able to do the impossible, bring Michael back home. That morning, in that season forgotten by time, they didn't know it yet, but they had done something more powerful than any peace treaty. They had sealed a silent pact of unconditional love, a pact that neither war, nor distance, nor death would be able to break. And so, with the train disappearing over the horizon and a thread of hope holding two hearts apart, the real battle began. A silent battle, fought not with weapons, but with longing, faith, and the courage to wait. When Michael arrived in Vietnam, the first thing that hit him wasn't the deafening noise of the helicopters or the acrid smell of smoke. Hanging in the air it was the heat, a suffocating, heavy, almost solid heat that seemed to envelop every inch of the skin and prevent even the simple act of breathing. The dense jungle stretched ahead like a living monster, pulsing with a life of its own, where every shadow could hide death and every sound was a belated warning. The war, so distant and abstract in the news, became brutally real. Michael quickly discovered that there were no clearly defined heroes or villains, just young men, on both sides, fighting for survival in a landscape where the line between right and wrong had long ago dissolved. The enemy was invisible, camouflaged by the forest, confused among civilians, waiting patiently for a moment of carelessness. Every step on the trail could be the last. The patrols were endless, Hours of marching with heavy backpacks, crossing muddy rice paddies, boot-sucking swamps, and forests so thick the sunlight barely touched the ground. The nights were worse. The absolute darkness, cut only by the intermittent glow of fireflies and the watchful eyes of men, transformed every sound, a broken twig, a rustle of leaves, into an imminent threat. Fear was a constant companion, a silent presence that tensed muscles and kept sleep at bay. Michael adapted, because there was no choice. He learned to distinguish the sounds of the forest, to sleep with one hand on his gun, to eat anything he could find. But adaptation did not mean acceptance. With each passing day, he felt like a part of himself was being ripped away, left to rot under the mud of the jungle. The letters from home were the only bridge that connected him to the world that seemed to have been swallowed by the nightmare. When the mail arrived, sometimes after weeks of delay, the men gathered like children waiting for Christmas presents. Michael read and reread Elizabeth's words until he memorized each line, as if he could bring her voice back, even if only in his mind. The special letter, the one he had promised to open only in the most difficult moment, remained intact, folded and kept close to his chest, like a last reserve of hope. The losses came early and cruelly. The first friend to die was Danny, a boy from Chicago who dreamed of being a teacher. An ambush, a well-aimed shot in the chest, and, suddenly, the person with whom Michael shared confidences and cigarettes was just a lifeless body, covered by a green tarp. There was no time for mourning. There was no room for tears, just orders, movements, survival. As the months passed, Michael began to understand that the real threat in Vietnam was not just the stray bullet or the landmine. It was the silent wear of the soul. It was the way hope vanished drop by drop, how humanity was corroded by the incessant repetition of death. It was the moment when men stopped looking each other in the eye, for fear of seeing in them a reflection of their own despair. He saw it in the faces around him, the slow, painful transformation of the boys into ghosts of themselves. He saw it in himself, on the mornings when the reflecting pool showed a face aged far beyond his early 20s. Sometimes at night, when the camp seemed quiet, Michael would take the letter out of his pocket and hold it in his hands, feeling the soft paper beneath his calloused fingers. I didn't open it, not yet. But he let his simple presence serve as a reminder that there was something to fight for, something beyond war, something that was worth every step suffered, every fear silenced, every bitter loss. The hell of Vietnam wasn't just physical, it was mental, it was spiritual. It was a constant test of endurance, not just of the muscles, but of the spirit. And Michael knew that with each day he survived, with each sunrise he managed to see, it wasn't just luck. It was the weight of the promise he carried with him, the echo of words he had not yet read, but which already supported him in ways he barely understood. Each shot, each explosion, each lost friend brought him a little closer to the moment he feared so much, and, at the same time, needed so much. The moment to finally open that letter. The moment when he would have to decide whether he would allow the war to break him, or whether he would find the strength to keep fighting, not just for himself, but for the love he had sworn to protect at all costs. Vietnam tried to kill him every day, but inside Michael's chest, folded with care and filled with hope, a simple letter continued to beat like a separate heart, a silent reminder that even in the midst of hell, there were still reasons to come home. If this story has touched your heart so far, imagine what is yet to come. Every detail you've heard so far has been just the beginning, the true decisive moment where Michael's life will depend on something far beyond physical strength is about to happen. And I want to invite you to be part of this journey in an even more special way. If you feel that stories like this deserve to be shared, if something inside you believes in the power of love and hope, take advantage of this moment and subscribe to the channel now. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing real, exciting, and unforgettable stories. Also, leave a like. It shows that we are together at every step of this journey, and don't stop now. Stay with me, because in the next chapter you will witness the most dramatic moment in this entire story, the moment when Michael, faced with absolute despair, will have to decide between giving up or finding strength in something he doesn't yet know, something that could change everything. Get ready, because what comes next will deeply stir your emotions. The sky over Vietnam that day was a strange color, a heavy mix of gray and gold, as if the world itself was suspended, breathing hard. The patrol advanced cautiously along the narrow trail, surrounded by bamboo. Each soldier tense, eyes scanning the forest as if searching for ghosts. The air was thick, and Michael felt, deep in his bones, that something was about to happen. It wasn't fear. It was a silent certainty, like the premonition before a storm. The attack came like thunder. Explosions ripped through the silence of the forest, and the ground shook beneath Michael's feet. Shots cracked from all sides, fired from unseen places. Men screamed, threw themselves to the ground, sought shelter behind trees that offered little protection. Chaos took over within seconds. Michael tried to move, but a searing pain shot through his leg like a red-hot knife. He looked down and saw blood flowing freely, mixing with the mud. The first feeling was shock. Then came the pain, hot and brutal. He tried to crawl out of the line of fire, but each movement seemed to pull his soul out of his body. The noise around him became more distant, as if he were sinking in a heavy, dark sea. The faces of his companions blurred before his eyes, some shouting orders, others carrying wounded, but no one seemed to see him. Nobody seemed to hear him. Alone, lying in the mud, Michael felt something even more devastating than physical pain. The certainty that he would not be able to return home. The promise he had made to Elizabeth, the White House with the porch, the lazy Sundays in the sun. Everything seemed to be falling apart before his eyes. And for the first time since arriving in Vietnam, the idea of giving up whispered in his ear with a tempting voice. It was so easy. All you had to do was close your eyes. All I had to do was let the pain take over. Nobody would blame him. He fought. He tried. It was then that his hand, almost unconsciously, touched the inside pocket of his jacket. The fabric was soaked with sweat and blood, but inside, miraculously intact, was the small envelope with the red ribbon. The letter, Elizabeth's letter. The letter he had promised to open only at his worst moment. And that, without a doubt, was the worst of all. With trembling, mud-stained fingers, Michael took the envelope out of his pocket. For months, he had resisted the temptation to open it. He had kept that piece of hope, like someone keeping a last match in the middle of a storm. Now, however, there was no choice. It was that or the end. He carefully tore off the tape and opened the paper, the handwritten words trembling before his blurry eyes. Elizabeth began by saying, "If you're reading this, it's because you're facing your hardest day. I wish I could be there, holding your hand, looking into your eyes and telling you that everything is going to be okay. But since I can't, I put all the love I have for you into these words." Michael closed his eyes, and it was as if he could hear her voice, soft and steady, reaching across distance and time to reach him in that hell. "You are stronger than you know. You are made of the same stuff that builds bridges, that withstands storms, that turns dreams into reality. You promised to come back to me, and I promise that I will be here, waiting, counting the days, rooting for you every dawn." Tears ran freely down Michael's face, mixing with the mud and blood. Each word seemed to pull him out of the darkness, pull him back to the surface. If fear grips your chest, remember, you are not alone. My love is there with you, in every beat of your heart. Breathe, fight, come back to me. There, lying on the cold ground of Vietnam, amid the distant sound of fighting and the smell of wet earth, Michael made his choice. I wouldn't give up, not today, not now, not while someone, on the other side of the world, believed in him so strongly. With superhuman effort, he pulled his body, dragging himself inch by inch toward the safe zone. Every movement was a fight against pain, against despair, against the desire to simply close my eyes and disappear. But he followed, driven not by obligation, but by love. For the promise, time has lost its meaning. The pain became background noise. All that mattered was moving forward. And after what seemed like an eternity, he felt hands grabbing him, voices calling his name, lights shining above his head. Rescued by his companions, rushed to the evacuation helicopter. Michael clutched what was left of the letter to his chest, now stained with blood, but still legible, still alive. As the helicopter rose away from the dammed ground, where he had almost lost everything, Michael closed his eyes and, for the first time in months, allowed himself a weak smile. Because I knew, with the deepest certainty, that I would survive. Not just because I wanted to live, but because there was a promise to keep, a house to build, a love waiting for him. And all of this strength, all of this hope, had come from a simple sheet of paper. written by loving hands, filled with faith, a letter that day had done much more than save his life. He had saved his soul. The helicopter roared over the devastated fields as Michael, lying on the makeshift stretcher, felt the vibration of the engine as if it were the drum of life itself calling him home. His half-closed eyes caught flashes of the heavy sky above him, the blue mixed with dense clouds, the strong smell of fuel mixed with dust. He knew he was between life and death. He knew that part of his body might never fully recover, but there was something stronger than the throbbing pain in his injured leg, stronger even than the fear that had paralyzed him moments before. There was the living presence of Elizabeth's letter, still clutched in his blood-stained hand. The letter seemed to have merged with him, like an extension of his own chest. The handwritten words vibrated within him, as if they were his new bloodstream. They weren't just sentences on a piece of paper. They were silent votes, crossed breaths from an impossible distance, hopes transformed into concrete forces. When he was transferred to the makeshift infirmary at the Da Nang base, Michael had little time to understand everything that was happening around him. Nurses screamed, surgeons cut blood-soaked uniforms, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with gunpowder. But in the center of all this confusion, in the midst of the hands pressing on his wound and the needles searching for his veins, Michael felt a strange caress. If Elizabeth's letter were an invisible shield around him, protecting him not just physically, but spiritually. During the first days of recovery, when the fever burned his body and his consciousness came and went like a drifting boat, the letter was his anchor. He read it, reread it, murmured passages to himself in moments when the pain threatened to overcome him. Every word seemed imbued with life, with warmth, with humanity, everything that war tried to steal. You are stronger than you know. My love is there with you, in every beat of your heart. Come back to me. These phrases have become silent mantras. It didn't matter that the world around him was falling apart. It didn't matter that each news that arrived from the front brought more deaths, more losses, more despair. As long as those words existed, as long as he could touch them, read them, live them, there was a reason to move forward. Doctors were surprised by his recovery. Although the wound was serious, Michael showed unusual strength, an iron will to live. Other men, in similar conditions, succumbed to depression, gave in to pain, sometimes even refused treatment. But Michael seemed driven by an invisible force, as if something or someone pulled him away from the abyss every time he came too close to the edge. Companions at the hospital began to notice. They saw the young soldier, lying in bed number 17, religiously holding a crumpled piece of paper, his lips moving in barely audible whispers. Some mocked, others just watched in silence. But no one could deny that there was something extraordinary happening there, something that transcended medications and surgeries, something that had to do with faith, with love, with hope. Michael, in turn, knew that he was being rebuilt, not only in his body, but also in his spirit. Each word of the letter was like a brick, a piece carefully placed to restore what the war had tried to demolish. His identity, his courage, his humanity. He was not just a number, a predicted casualty in military reports. He was someone who loved and was loved, and that, in the end, was more powerful than any weapon. On the afternoons, when he was able to sit up in bed, looking out the small infirmary window at the green expanse of Vietnam, Michael daydreamed. I imagined Lizzie on the porch of the White House, her dress fluttering in the breeze, her smile lighting up the world around her. I imagined the smell of fresh coffee in the morning, the leisurely conversations in the shade of the old walnut tree in the backyard. I imagined not just surviving, but truly living. And in all these dreams, the letter was there, not as a mere piece of paper, but as a living promise, a thread of light piercing the thickest darkness, a reminder that true love is not broken by distance, pain, or war. True love crosses invisible borders, survives battles that never appear in history books, and becomes, itself, a force capable of saving lives. When he was finally released from the infirmary and assigned to return to the United States for extended treatment, Michael held the letter as his greatest treasure. He knew the road back would still be long and difficult. There would be rehabilitation, surgeries, lonely nights of pain and longing. But there was something that the war had not been able to take away from him, something that not even death could touch: the hope. Hope, written in blue ink on a crumpled piece of paper that had traveled thousands of miles, faced jungles, battles, and horrors to reach him, to remind you, when all seemed lost, that there was still a home waiting, a love waiting, a life waiting, and Michael Turner, against all odds, was determined to get back to it all. The military plane that brought Michael back to the United States touched down with a heavy crash, as if every inch of that landing carried the weight of the stories, the wounds, and the broken dreams of the men it was carrying. For many, that return was a silent arrival, full of invisible scars. For Michael, it was rebirth. Still lying on the stretcher, with his leg immobilized and his body weakened, he felt something different in his chest, a strength that came, not from youth, nor from military training, but from something that had grown inside him like a silent root during the months of darkness. It was a force made of love, of promise, of handwritten words that went through hell to find you. The rehabilitation was brutal. Endless days and nights of painful physical therapy, reconstructive surgeries, moments when the body seemed to want to give up, and the mind, even more so. Many around him succumbed to the silent depression that corroded the corridors of the military hospital, the mourning for fallen comrades, the guilt over survival, the feeling of inadequacy in the face of a civilian life that now seemed so distant. All of this created a heavy environment, where each step forward was a Herculean victory. But Michael was different. Each morning, when the sun rose shyly through the infirmary window, he searched the inside pocket of his new jacket for the worn-out envelope. Elizabeth's letter wasn't just a reminder of the past, it was a roadmap for the future. Her words echoed in his mind like a war drum, not to destroy him, but to guide him through rebuilding himself. You are made of the stuff that builds bridges. That's what Michael did. Every day, he rebuilt the bridges within himself, between pain and hope, between the man who had gone to war and the man who was returning, broken but not defeated. In each physical therapy session, when his body screamed at him to give up, he remembered the last line of the letter. Breathe, fight, come back to me. Breathe, to fight, to go back. 3 simple verbs that have become your daily mantra. It was no longer a question of just recovering the movement of his leg, but of recovering himself, the ability to dream, the ability to love, the ability to believe that the war, despite everything, had not been won. Time passed, and Michael, previously seen as just one of many injured people, began to attract attention among doctors and therapists. His determination was almost supernatural. His smile, even on the days of greatest pain, was a beacon that illuminated the heavy environment of the ward. He didn't talk much about what motivated him. The letter was a precious secret, something he carried close to his heart, like a reliquary that only he knew. Over time, he went from a wheelchair to crutches, from crutches to a hesitant walk, and then, with almost superhuman effort, to steady steps, although marked by the visible scar on his leg. But the invisible scar, the one that the war had carved into his soul, had not become a burden. It had become a silent medal of resistance. Michael now understood that he was not the same boy who had left Brookfield months before. With his eyes full of dreams and his heart full of promises, he was someone who had looked into the abyss and decided not to give himself up. This was someone who had learned, through pain and loss, that true heroism lies not in grandiose victories, but in silent persistence, in steps that refused to stop. At the end of his recovery, when he was finally released to return to civilian life, Michael did something that symbolized everything he had experienced. He kept Elizabeth's letter in a small wooden box, hand-carved by veterans at the hospital. He engraved 3 words on the lid, the same ones that had supported it: breathe, loot, times. And by keeping the letter, he didn't lock it in the past. On the contrary, it has become a living part of your present, a constant reminder. That love is stronger than any war. That hope, even in the darkest times, can bloom like a stubborn flower among the stones. Michael was no longer just a survivor. He was a man transformed by pain, yes, but even more so by love. A love that crossed the distance, resisted time, and won the war within him. And now, with the letter kept as a talisman of faith, he was finally ready to fulfill the promise he made at the train station months ago. He was ready to go back, home, for her, for the life that still awaited him. The road home was not a straight line for Michael Turner. It wasn't a simple boarding and disembarking, as he had dreamed of so many times on the hot, silent nights in the military infirmary. The return was a long journey, physical, emotional, and spiritual, between the life he had almost lost and the new man he was becoming. Even after medical discharge, his body still bore the deep marks of the war. Each step was a reminder of the bullet that had gone through his leg, of the damp land of Vietnam, of the faces that never returned. His soul was also a silent battlefield. The pain, the grief, the guilt for having survived while so many others were left behind formed invisible scars that no treatment could erase. The army sent him to a rehabilitation center at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, before finally releasing him to return to his hometown. There, surrounded by other men as broken as he was, Michael faced his toughest battle, learning to live again. Physiotherapy continued, now aimed at regaining full mobility, but it was the silent therapy of memories and promises that really shaped each new step. During the nights, alone in his room, he read Elizabeth's letter again. Even though he had already memorized it word for word, he needed to have it in his hands. He needed to feel the crumpled paper, as if it were the last solid bridge between him and the world he had left behind. It was a silent, intimate ritual, like a wordless prayer. With each reading, the distance between him and the life he wanted seemed to shrink a little more. The days at the rehab center were slow and painful, but each step forward, a step without crutches, a climb up the stairs without support, was silently celebrated by Michael as a small victory in his long journey to return to Lizzie. He knew he would soon have to face her. He knew that when he saw her again, he would no longer be the same boy who was gone, full of innocent dreams. I knew that maybe she had changed too. That war didn't just destroy those who went to the front, it devastated everything that was left behind. But there was something stronger than fear. The promise, the letter, the love. Finally, the day arrived. A letter, this time official, informed Michael that he was free to return home. He could, if he wanted, ask for help to find work, to begin studies through veterans programs, to rebuild civilian life. But at that moment, all he wanted was to go back, home. For Lizzie, the trip back was a whirlwind of contained emotions. On the commercial plane taking him back to Brookfield, Michael ran his fingers over the envelope kept in the inside pocket of his jacket, like a child seeking reassurance in a talisman. I looked out the window and saw the world below, cities spreading out like constellations, rivers meandering lazily across the land, roads intersecting like lines of destiny. And in the middle of it all, somewhere, there was her waiting. His heart was beating heavily in his chest. Every minute that brought him home was a harrowing mix of joy and fear. What if she had changed? What if the love that had resisted in the words did not resist in the reunion? What if the returning Michael was no longer capable of being the man she deserved? These questions echoed like silent thunder in his mind. But he didn't let fear win, because, deep down, he knew that what was between them was more than just nice words. It was a story written in promises, in struggles, in silent resistance. The bus that took him from the big city to Brookfield seemed to move slowly, as if time, now that it was approaching the reunion, refused to run. Michael recognized the golden fields, the small farms, the outline of trees against the golden evening sky. It was like returning to a dream I feared I had lost forever. When the bus finally stopped at the small station where it all began, where months before he had said goodbye with a heavy heart, Michael felt his hands sweat. He got up, adjusted, his backpack on his shoulder, and, with his legs still a little stiff, went down to the platform. The setting sun cast long golden shadows across the worn wooden floor, and for a moment he stood there, just breathing, feeling the weight of everything he had experienced and the silent miracle of still being there. There was no music band, there was no crowd, there was only her. Lizzie, standing at the end of the platform, with a blue dress gently swaying in the wind, just like on the day of departure, the loose hair, the eyes filled with emotion, the hesitant smile of someone who waited much longer than time could measure. Michael began to walk, slowly at first, then faster, ignoring the pain throbbing in his leg. Each step was a victory against death, against distance, against doubt. And as he approached, as the world around him seemed to disappear, he knew, with a clarity that swept away every shadow of fear, he wasn't just heading back to Brookfield. I was returning home. It was coming back to her. He was finally fulfilling the promise engraved in every word of that precious letter. For a moment that seemed infinite, Michael and Elizabeth stood there, standing on the platform of the small station, just a few steps away from each other, while the world around them fell silent. The wind whispered between the wooden planks, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and dry leaves, as if even nature was holding its breath, respecting that sacred moment. Michael's eyes, hardened by months of horror and loss, met Elizabeth's, and in that instant all the pain, all the fear, all the distance disappeared. There were only the two of them left, linked by something that war, pain and time could never erase. Elizabeth took a hesitant step forward, then another, as if she feared this was all a fragile dream, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Michael, staggering, moved too, his legs still marked by the stiffness of recovery, but his heart lighter than he had ever remembered. When they finally met, there were no words. They didn't need to. Elizabeth threw her arms round his neck with an almost desperate urgency, and Michael, even though his body ached, wrapped her in a hug that was more than a gesture. It was a promise fulfilled, a silent miracle. She cried, her face hidden against his chest, sobs trapped in her throat, as if everything that had been held in during those months of absence was finally collapsing. Michael closed his eyes and rested his chin in her hair, inhaling that familiar smell, the smell of home, of love, of life. Neither of them wanted to let go. Neither of them wanted the moment to end. There, in the middle of the empty station, with no witnesses other than the setting sun and the persistent wind, two hearts, so broken and mended, found their way back to each other. After long minutes, Elizabeth raised her face, her teary eyes searching his. "You're back," she whispered, as if she was still struggling to believe it. Michael just nodded, his voice catching in his throat. In his left hand, still clenched tightly, he held the crumpled envelope, now as worn by time as himself. "That's what brought me back," he said finally, in a hoarse voice, showing the letter. Elizabeth looked at the envelope, recognizing the faded red ribbon, the paper she had touched so many times with hope and fear. She held out her hand, and Michael placed the envelope in her palm, as if he were handing her a war trophy. "I read it. At the worst time when I thought I wouldn't make it. And it was your voice, your words, that saved me." Elizabeth clutched the envelope to her chest, as if holding something infinitely precious, and renewed tears ran down her face. But now they were different tears. They were no longer of fear or despair. They were grateful, of relief, of absolute love. Michael, still looking at her, smiled, a shy, tired, but true smile. For the first time in many months, he felt whole. He felt human. He felt loved. The walk to the car was slow. Michael walked with a slight limp, but refused to use any support. Elizabeth walked beside him, a firm hand holding his, as if to ensure he never got lost along the way again. The ride into town was silent, but it was a comfortable silence, full of deep meaning. They didn't need to talk about what they had lost. They didn't need to name each wound. They both knew that the war had left marks visible and invisible, but they also knew that the love that united them was stronger than any scar. When they arrived at Elizabeth's old house, the porch was, as he remembered, flowers in clay pots, a rocking chair creaking softly in the wind, the smell of baking bread coming from the kitchen. A home, a dream rebuilt, brick by brick, memory by memory. Elizabeth led him to the rocking chair and sat down next to him. Michael took the letter out of his jacket pocket one last time and placed it between them, not to read it again, but to leave it there, a silent witness to everything they had gone through. "We promised we would build a life together," he said, his voice low but firm. Elizabeth smiled, a smile full of light and tenderness. "And we're still going, starting now." Night fell slowly over Brookfield, and the stars began to appear in the sky, one by one, like twinkling little miracles. On the porch, sitting side by side, without rushing, without fear, Michael and Elizabeth began a new battle. This time, not against death, but in favor of life. And between them, resting like a silent blessing, was the letter that proved that true love can cross any distance, survive any war, and rebuild what seemed irretrievably lost. The war was behind us, but its shadow still hung over Michael and Elizabeth's days like a silent fog. Even so, there was something stronger than the echoes of the past. The decision, renewed with each dawn, to build a life together, not despite what they had experienced, but precisely because of it. In the first months after their reunion, their routine was made up of small, essential gestures. Michael relearned how to live outside of military rigidity, and Elizabeth, with her infinite patience, helped him reconnect with the civilian world that seemed so distant. There were moments of heavy silence, yes, in which Michael, lost in memories he dared not share, just stared out the window, his eyes fixed on some distant memory. But Elizabeth never pushed. She would just sit next to him, hold his hand, and stay there solid, constant, present. They knew that the love that brought them here needed to be nurtured every day. It wouldn't be easy, but they were both willing. The first big decision was simple and symbolic, buying a small plot of land on the outskirts of Brookfield, exactly where, years before, they dreamed of building the White House with a balcony. The land was covered in tall grass and rocks, but for them, it was a promised land. It was the place where the rubble of the past would give way to something new. Michael, even though he was still limited by a leg that would never be the same, insisted on working with his own hands. With the help of some friends from the city, some veterans like him, others just old acquaintances who understood the weight of what he had experienced, they began to build the first walls. Elizabeth, in turn, designed every detail of the house, took care of the decoration, planned each space as if each brick were a silent declaration of faith in the future. As the walls went up, so did Michael's confidence. The hammer in his hands, the smell of new wood, the sweat running down his forehead, all of it reconnected him with real life, with the present he had worked so hard to achieve. Each hammer strike seemed to say, I survived, I came back, I belong. At night, exhausted, they sat together on the improvised porch and talked about plans. They wanted children, they wanted starry nights without fear, they wanted loud laughs and lazy Sundays. They wanted the kind of life that the war seemed to have made impossible, but which, miraculously, was still within their reach. Of course, not every day was perfect. There were nightmares that ripped Michael from sleep, breaking into a cold sweat and fighting invisible enemies. There were days when the physical pain left him irritable and withdrawn. But in each of those silent battles, Elizabeth was there not to erase the scars, but to remind her that they were only part of the story, not the whole story. The letter that had saved Michael in his darkest days gained a place of honor in the new home. Framed and hanging on the living room wall, it was more than a keepsake. It was a monument to what they had overcome together. Visitors saw the painting and asked questions, curious, and Michael, with a discreet smile, told the story. Not as someone showing off a wound, but as someone showing off a medal of love and resistance. Their wedding was simple, as they dreamed of. Few guests, flowers picked in the field, a ceremony at dusk with the sky painted in golden and lilac tones. When Elizabeth walked up to him, wearing a simple white dress and a smile that shined brighter than any diamond, Michael knew that no moment in Vietnam, no matter how dark it was, could dim the light of that moment. The words of the vows were exchanged with restrained but true emotion. Michael promised to be Elizabeth's home, even when the world seemed to fall apart. Elizabeth promised to be Michael's safe haven, even when the winds of fear were blowing hard. And so, under the silent blessing of the sunset, they sealed not just a marriage, but a story of redemption. They were no longer just a young couple full of dreams. They were survivors. They were builders of futures. They were living witnesses that, even when everything seems lost, true love is capable of rebuilding what seemed irreparably broken. After the war, life for Michael and Elizabeth wasn't perfect, but it was deeply real. Every laugh, every gesture of affection, every morning at each other's side carried a weight and a beauty that only those who have crossed the abyss can understand. And perhaps this is their greatest victory, not allowing the war to define who they were. But yes, that love shaped who they decided to be. Together, time, with its silent, relentless march, transformed Brookfield from a small rural town into a place where fields gave way to new streets, and where familiar faces were slowly replaced by generations who grew up hearing old stories. But in the white porch house, on the same land where dreams were rebuilt after the war, Michael and Elizabeth grew old together, living the love that a letter saved. Time was generous to them, not because it spared them their pain, because it didn't, but because it gave them the wisdom to find beauty even in the marks that life left. The scar on Michael's leg remained a constant reminder, as did the deep lines around Elizabeth's eyes, drawn by so many years of laughter, tears, and hope. The letter was still there, framed in the main room, not as a decorative adornment, but as a silent reliquary of the faith that has withstood war, fear, and the passing of decades. Often, visitors, friends, neighbors, curious young people would ask about the history of that sheet of paper aged under the glass, and Michael, with a low voice and a serene smile, told again how a simple letter saved a life and sustained love. Through hell, younger generations listened in amazement, many of them having never experienced mailed letters in an era of instant messaging and video calls. For them, it seemed almost impossible to imagine that handwritten words, crossing oceans and battlefields, could carry so much power. But as they listened to Michael speak, the emotion still alive in every word, they understood that the power was not in the paper, nor in the ink, but in the love that the words contained. Michael and Elizabeth had 3 children. They raised us with stories of silent courage and kept promises. They taught that true heroism is not always found in grand gestures, but often in small daily acts of fidelity, patience, and unconditional love. Each wedding anniversary, they revisited the story of the letter, like someone revisiting a sacred altar, a ritual to remember where they had come from and what it had taken to get there. The delighted grandchildren sat on the living room floor while their grandfather carefully removed the letter from the frame, wearing cotton gloves so as not to damage the fragile paper. He read it slowly, letting each word float in the air, as if reconstituting, in that instant, all the strength that sustained him in those dark days. Elizabeth watched, with teary eyes, knowing that each reading was also a testament to her faith, her hope, the silent strength of someone who loves without guarantees, but with all her heart. Over the years, their story spread. Beyond Brookfield's borders, a local museum dedicated to the memory of Vietnam War veterans invited Michael to share his account. And there, in a silent room, flanked by worn uniforms and faded medals, Elizabeth's letter was displayed in a special display case, accompanied by a simple plaque, handwritten hope, the letter that saved a soldier and a love. Michael and Elizabeth were not seeking recognition. They weren't looking for applause, but they knew that their story, simple and grand at the same time, could offer the world something increasingly rare, the certainty that even in the darkest days, faith and love still have the last word. They continued to visit the museum once a year, each visit a little slower, each walk holding hands a little shorter. But the sparkle in their eyes, upon seeing the letter on display, never went away. At home, life continued its course with the smoothness of the last chapters of a great novel. Lazy mornings on the balcony, afternoons of tea and conversations about the past, starry nights remembering shared dreams, and always, always, the letter, silent and eternal, as a living witness to everything they had been, everything they still were. And it was like this, amid soft laughter, the smell of cake coming out of the oven, and the sound of the wind rustling the curtains of the White House, that Michael and Elizabeth grew old together, living not only the story of a love that resisted the war, but writing, every day, a new letter, invisible to time, an endless love letter, because, in the end, Elizabeth's words written so many years ago hadn't just saved Michael on the battlefield, they had saved entire generations, teaching that true strength lies not in weapons, nor in power, but in the silent promises that sustain us even when all else fails. And as long as the letter lives, as long as someone reads it with an open heart, Michael and Elizabeth's story will never end. When we revisit the story of Michael and Elizabeth, we are not just hearing about an old, handwritten, love-filled letter. We are being invited to remember something that we often forget in the rush of modern life, that words have power, what hope has strength, that love, even when everything seems to fall apart, is still capable of building bridges over the deepest abysses. Elizabeth's letter was not just a piece of paper, it was a seed, a promise planted in the heart of a young man about to face the worst of humanity. And when the war tried to extinguish its light, it was this seed, watered by memories, faith, and longing, that blossomed even in the midst of the desert of pain. Every word Elizabeth wrote was chosen carefully, with tenderness and courage. She knew she might never get the chance to say them in person. I knew the paper could be the last thing Michael would hold in his final moments. And yet, he chose to talk about hope, strength, love. He chose to build, rather than surrender to fear. He chose to be a presence, even in his absence, and Michael, holding that letter in his wounded hands, found something that no military training could offer him. He found a reason to fight, a reason to survive, a reason to keep believing when all else seemed lost. How many times in our own lives have we felt on the verge of giving up? How many times are we surrounded by silent battles, illnesses, losses, frustrations, fears, and we feel like we don't have the strength to carry on? Their story reminds us that sometimes all we Need is the right word at the right time. A gesture of love, even a small one, can be the difference between surrender and hope. Elizabeth didn't save Michael with guns, with power, or with money. He saved him with words, with faith, with the courage to believe that love could cross the ocean, survive the crossfire, resist the distance, and overcome despair. And Michael, in turn, teaches us that accepting this hope, trusting it, holding on to it with all our strength, is, in itself, a heroic act. Words have weight. They build or destroy. They strengthen or discourage. In a world where so many voices scream, where so many messages are empty or hurtful, Elizabeth's letter is a reminder that the words we choose have the power to change destinies. We may not be on literal battlefields, but we all fight silent wars every day. And we all have the opportunity to be, for someone, what Elizabeth was for Michael, a voice of hope in the midst of chaos, an anchor in the midst of the storm. Sometimes all someone needs is a letter, from a message. Give a word of encouragement, something that says, "I believe in you. You are stronger than you know. You are not alone." The love written by Elizabeth crossed the jungle of Vietnam, survived time, took root in a family, inspired a city, reached generations. And even today, as his words are read, their echo continues to spread, a silent call for us not to give up, so that we can also be bearers of hope. It's easy to underestimate the power of a simple gesture, a letter, a visit, a phone call. And I'm here said sincerely. But it is these gestures, invisible to the eyes of the world, that build the bridges that save us when the storms arrive. The story of Michael and Elizabeth teaches us that victory does not always occur on battlefields or on the great stages of history. Sometimes victory happens in an empty train station, on a muddy battlefield, in a silent room where someone reads a letter and decides to live another day. And more than that, it teaches that true love is not just feelings, it's action, it's choice. It's a promise renewed daily, even when it's easier to give up. Maybe today you are fighting your own silent war. Maybe you know someone who is struggling not to get lost in the darkness. Let Michael and Elizabeth's story be a reminder. Never underestimate the power you have to shine a light in someone's life. Never doubt that sometimes a word of love is stronger than all the forces that try to destroy us. Because in the end, when the battles cease, when the winds finally calm, this is what remains: the words of hope we gave and received, the silent promises that sustained our souls. And may we, like Elizabeth, be the ones who write invisible letters of faith to the world, even if we never know how many lives we can save with them. The most powerful stories are not those that simply recount great feats, but those that silently change those who hear them. And the story of Michael and Elizabeth is exactly like that, a narrative that doesn't scream, but echoes in the hearts of those who know it, like a soft melody that continues to play even after the silence. When we look back at the entire journey we took together in this story, from leaving at the train station, to the silent pain of the battlefield, to despair on the brink of death, to reading a letter that saved a soul, we understand that we weren't just hearing about two people separated by war. We were, in fact, traveling through the purest essence of what true love is. Michael didn't just return home with scars on his body. He returned with his soul tattooed with hope. Elizabeth was not just a bride who waited patiently. She was the silent author of a salvation. And between them, uniting their torn worlds, was always the letter, a small sheet of paper, but a monument of faith, resistance, and love. Time, that tireless artist who transforms everything he touches, continued to shape their lives. The wrinkles arrived, the hair turned white, the steps became slower. But what truly defined them never changed: the promise kept, the faith unshakable, the love that not only survived, flourished. The letter, now preserved forever, continues to inspire all who see it, not as an old object, but as a testimony that the right words, sent at the right time, can be more powerful than any weapon, more lasting than any stone monument. There, between the lines written by a young woman full of fear and hope, the universal truth pulses. Love is stronger than war. Hope is stronger than despair. Promises made from the heart cross oceans, survive fire, and are reborn in time. Maybe you, who have followed this story so far, are carrying your own invisible wars. Maybe you know the weight of distance, of longing, of doubt. Perhaps you face battles the world has never seen. And if so, may Elizabeth's words resonate with you too. You are stronger than you know. breathe, fight, come back to who you are. Go back to the one who loves you. Go back to your dream, even if the world tried to erase it. Return to the hope that still lives, even if buried under the ashes of pain. In the end, Michael and Elizabeth's story doesn't just belong to them, it belongs to all of us. Because all of us, at some point, have held an invisible card to our chest. All of us, at some point, have struggled to keep hope alive that seemed to be fading. And if a simple letter, written by hand, was able to overcome bombs, bullets, and tears to save a life, imagine what your love, your word, your presence can do in someone's life today. When everything that seemed solid crumbled, when their world fell apart, Michael and Elizabeth taught the world a silent but eternal lesson. It is not the strength of the body that saves us, it is the strength of love. So, carry that story with you. Let it live in your gestures, in your words, in your encounters. Also be someone who writes invisible letters of hope in the hearts of those who need it most. And remember, when all else fails, when the darkness seems overwhelming, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and listen to the words that crossed Vietnam, crossed decades, and now echo to you. You've already won. You just need to go back. May the story of Michael and Elizabeth continue to be told, not only as a memory of war and resilience, but as an eternal flame of hope burning in the hearts of humanity. Because as long as there is love written in simple words, as long as there is faith deposited in silent gestures, the world will still have salvation. And that letter will live on forever. If this story touched your heart in the same way it transformed Michael and Elizabeth's lives, I want to extend a special invitation to you. Every word that crossed oceans to save a life has now reached you, and if in any way this message strengthened you, made you reflect, or gave you hope, return this moment. Subscribe to the channel and leave your like. This is the simplest and most powerful way of saying that stories of love, faith, and overcoming still have a place in the world. And if you made it this far, share it in the comments. I choose to believe in the power of love. Your presence and your voice here are part of this chain of transformation that began with a simple letter and that now continues through each of us.